The summer of 1981 shimmered with a golden, almost deceptive, light over Briarwood, Oregon. It was the kind of summer that tasted of sweet watermelon, smelled of freshly cut grass, and promised endless days of sun-drenched childhood. For Sarah Thorne, those days revolved around her three boisterous, perpetually synchronized 4-year-old boys, Adam, Benjamin, and Christopher. Identical in every freckle and mischievous grin, they were a whirlwind of energy, a constant testament to the vibrant chaos of their lives. That particular Saturday, the air hung heavy with a gentle warmth, perfect for a picnic at Heron Creek Park. James Thorne, Sarah's husband, a man whose easygoing nature was usually a welcome counterpoint to Sarah's meticulousness, had packed the cooler with his signature enthusiasm. More potato salad than strictly necessary and enough lemonade to quench a small army. Sarah, meticulously organized even in leisure, had laid out a checkered blanket beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak, its leaves rustling like whispered secrets. Adam, ever the leader, was already scaling the low-hanging branches, his twin brothers, Benjamin and Christopher, a step behind, mimicking his every move with wide-eyed admiration. Their laughter, bright and unburdened, echoed through the park, a melody that would forever haunt Sarah's dreams. "Stay close, boys," Sarah called out, her voice a warm breeze. James merely chuckled, pulling a worn paperback from his bag. "Let them explore, hon. They're like little adventurers." He had a point. The triplets, dressed in matching blue overalls, were a blur of motion, darting between trees, their shouts of "Ready or not, here we come," fading and then reappearing, a game of hide-and-seek among the ancient trees. Sarah busied herself with repacking the picnic basket, carefully folding the checkered blanket. The sun, dipping lower, cast long, playful shadows across the grass. She hummed a tune, a quiet contentment settling over her. Just a moment, she told herself, just a moment to tidy up. She glanced up, expecting to see a glimpse of blue overalls, a flash of their blonde heads, but the space beneath the oak was still. The rustling leaves were the only sound, now seeming to whisper of emptiness. A prickle of unease, faint at first, began to spread through her. "Boys," she called, a little louder this time. No answer. James, engrossed in his book, didn't stir. "James," she said, a sharper edge to her voice, "have you seen them?" He lowered his book, a mild annoyance flickering in his eyes. "They're playing, Sarah. They're always playing." But they weren't. Sarah scanned the clearing, her heart beginning a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She walked towards the cluster of trees where they had been playing, calling their names, her voice growing increasingly desperate. "Adam, Benjamin, Christopher." The names, usually met with a chorus of replies, now fell into an echoing silence. The sun, once golden, seemed to leach the color from the world. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced her. This wasn't a game. This wasn't normal. James, finally sensing the raw panic in her voice, stood up, his face paling. Together, they started to search, their frantic calls tearing through the peaceful afternoon. They combed the park, their voices growing hoarse, their steps heavier with each passing minute. The park, once a playground of innocent joy, now felt vast, menacing, its familiar corners hiding unseen terrors. When the first police car, a stark black and white against the fading light, pulled into the park, its siren a mournful wail that shattered the evening calm, Sarah knew, the last vestiges of hope, clinging to the possibility of a simple misunderstanding, evaporated like mist. Her boys were gone, and with them, a piece of her soul. The questions began, relentless and agonizing, echoing in the growing twilight. When did you last see them? What were they wearing? Did they talk to anyone? Each question a fresh stab, each answer a testament to the gaping hole in her life. The world, once vibrant and full of the laughter of her triplets, had suddenly gone silent, replaced by an unbearable emptiness. The summer of 2011 in Briarwood bore little resemblance to its golden predecessor. The once vibrant hues had faded, replaced by the muted tones of time and solitude. Sarah Thorne, now a woman of 65, carried the weight of those intervening decades not just in the gentle stoop of her shoulders, but in the deep-set lines around eyes that still instinctively scanned every passing child. She lived alone in the same house where Adam, Benjamin, and Christopher had once filled every corner with their infectious laughter and endless energy. James, unable to bear the suffocating silence, had left years ago, his departure a quiet echo of the larger loss that had swallowed their lives whole. The house itself felt like a living tomb of memories. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced through the curtains, illuminating particles of a past that refused to settle. Every scuff on the wooden floor, every faded mark on the kitchen wall where their heights had been charted, whispered of what once was. Sarah moved through these rooms like a ghost, a silent guardian of the remnants of her vanished family. Her days were a quiet ritual, morning coffee on the porch, watching the world move on without her, and then the slow, deliberate pilgrimage to the spare room she had long ago converted into a shrine. This room was a time capsule, meticulously preserved. Toys sat untouched on shelves, a tiny tricycle stood poised as if waiting for a rider, and the walls were adorned with countless photographs. Faded Polaroids of 3 bright-eyed boys smiling gap-toothed at the camera. School pictures with slightly smudged edges, candid shots of them tumbling in the backyard, their blue overalls a blur. Sarah would spend hours there, running a trembling finger over their faces, trying to conjure their voices, the feel of their small hands in hers. It was a bittersweet torment, a desperate attempt to keep them alive in some tangible way. Lately, an unsettling thought had begun to niggle at her. These precious memories, preserved on fragile paper and even more fragile videocassettes, were slowly decaying. The colors on the photos were fading, the edges of the videotapes curling with age. A quiet panic started to bloom in her chest. What if these last tangible links to her sons were lost? What if, one day, all she had left were the increasingly blurry images in her mind? It was this fear that spurred her decision. She would digitize them. Every single photograph, every precious frame of home video. It was a daunting task, a journey she knew would be fraught with emotional landmines, but it was a pilgrimage she had to make. She imagined the files on her computer safe and sound, a digital fortress against the erosion of time. She pictured a clear, crisp image of their faces, forever preserved no matter how many years passed. As she carefully stacked the dusty VHS tapes by the old VCR, a profound sense of temporal displacement washed over her. For Sarah, the clock had stopped on that fateful summer day in 1981. Every moment since had been an extension of that unbearable void, a hollow echo in a world that insisted on moving forward. People said time healed all wounds, but for Sarah it had merely deepened them, carving out an even larger space for the grief that was now as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. She was still in 1981, forever searching for 3 small boys in blue overalls. And now she would begin the process of unearthing those lost moments, unaware that within the grainy flicker of an old home video, a truth lay dormant, waiting to shatter the silence of 30 years. The hum of the old VCR as it whirred to life was a sound Sarah had grown accustomed to over the past few days. Her dining room table was now a makeshift digital archive, strewn with unlabeled VHS tapes, stacks of photographs, and the glowing screen of her laptop. Each digitized memory was a tiny victory, a moment snatched back from the clutches of time. But it was also an emotional gauntlet, every frame a potential trigger, a reminder of the raw, unyielding pain. Today, she had picked up a tape simply labeled Summer 81. Her stomach tightened with a familiar knot of apprehension. This was the one. The last recorded moments before the world tilted on its axis. She took a deep, shaky breath and pressed play. The grainy image flickered onto the screen, instantly transporting her back. There they were, her boys. 4 years old, a riot of blonde curls and boundless energy. The video, filmed by James, captured the mundane beauty of a Saturday morning on their backyard. Adam, ever the most adventurous, was attempting to climb the old oak tree near the fence, his little legs pumping with determined effort. Benjamin, usually the quiet observer, was crouched by the sandbox, meticulously building a castle of damp sand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Christopher. Sarah watched, a phantom ache blooming in her chest. She could almost smell the fresh-cut grass, hear their innocent chatter. She let the tape run, letting the waves of nostalgia wash over her, a bitter comfort. She saw James's hand, momentarily blocking the lens as he adjusted the camera, then his laugh echoing from behind the device. It was a perfect, ordinary morning. And then it happened. A subtle shift in the frame, almost imperceptible. As James panned the camera from Christopher to Benjamin, Sarah's gaze snagged on something in the background, something that had always been there, yet she had never truly seen. Parked a little too close to their side fence, nestled partially behind the towering lilac bushes, was a delivery van. Not just any van, it was the distinct pale green and white livery of Briarwood Blooms, the local flower shop. Its logo, a stylized rose, was unmistakable. Sarah frowned. A faint ripple of confusion, then a whisper of unease, crept into her consciousness. Briarwood Blooms. She and James hadn't ordered any flowers that week. No anniversaries, no special occasions. Why would their van be parked right there, so close to their property line? It wasn't on the road, where a delivery vehicle might typically stop. It was almost concealed. She paused the video, the grainy image of the van frozen on screen. She zoomed in, pixelation distorting the edges, but the logo remained clear. Briarwood Blooms. She pressed play again, watching the clip repeatedly, her eyes glued to the van. It remained there for several seconds, visible for a brief window as James moved the camera, before disappearing behind the bushes once more. A tremor, light but persistent, ran through her. It was such a small detail, yet it felt terribly wrong. The police had pored over every detail, every minute of that awful day. They had questioned neighbors, searched every inch of their property, and even reviewed this very video. Sarah herself had watched it countless times, each viewing a self-inflicted wound, but neither she nor the investigators had ever mentioned the Briarwood Blooms van. It seemed insignificant, a mere ghost in the background of a tragedy. But a cold, unsettling knot formed in Sarah's stomach. In a life consumed by the inexplicable, even the smallest anomaly now demanded attention. This was more than just a background detail. This was a seed of doubt, planted after 30 years, now beginning to sprout in the fertile ground of her enduring grief. And with it, a terrifying thought began to take root. Had someone, been there that morning? Someone she never knew to look for? The Briarwood phone book, a relic from a bygone era, felt surprisingly heavy in Sarah's trembling hands. The paper, yellowed and brittle with age, seemed to resist her touch, each page a testament to a world that had moved on, leaving her suspended in time. She flipped through the dog-eared pages, her finger tracing the faded print until she found it. Briarwood Blooms, Est 1968. The name itself, a quaint echo of the town's pastoral charm, seemed to mock the chilling mystery she had just uncovered. She remembered Mrs. Evelyn Stone, the former owner, a woman with a kind smile and an encyclopedic knowledge of every flower grown in the county. Mrs. Stone had always been particularly fond of children, often slipping the triplets tiny rosebuds or sprigs of lavender whenever Sarah pushed their triple stroller past the shop. It was hard to reconcile that image with the ominous presence of her delivery van in her backyard on that day. Sarah's gaze drifted to the small section for employees. Among the neatly typed names, one jumped out at her. Emily Davison. Emily had been a sweet, quiet girl, just a few years older than Sarah, who had worked part-time at the flower shop during the summers of her college years. They hadn't been close friends, not in the intimate way Sarah had with her lifelong confidants, but they had shared enough pleasant conversations over bouquets and floral arrangements to consider themselves friendly acquaintances. Emily had moved away shortly after 1981, as many of the younger generation did, seeking opportunities beyond Briarwood's quiet embrace. Sarah hadn't thought of her in decades. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Would Emily even remember her? Would she remember anything useful from so long ago? Doubt gnawed at her, but the image of that van, frozen on her laptop screen, spurred her on. With a deep breath, Sarah dialed the number listed beside Emily's name, her thumb hovering over the last digit. A silent prayer on her lips. The phone rang 3 times before a hesitant voice answered. "Hello?" "Emily, is that Emily Davison?" Sarah's voice cracked, a tremor she couldn't control. A pause. "This is Emily. Who is this, please?" The voice was older, touched by the years, but unmistakably hers. "Emily, it's Sarah Thorne, from Briarwood, from the flower shop days." Sarah braced herself, ready for the inevitable shift in tone, the sudden rush of sympathy that always accompanied the mention of her name in this town. There was another, longer pause. Then a softer, almost reverent tone. "Sarah? Oh, Sarah, it's been so long. How are you?" I'm here, Emily," Sarah managed, a dry laugh escaping her lips. "Listen, I know this is out of the blue, and it's a strange question, but I was looking at some old videos from 1981, and I saw something that confused me. It was the Briarwood Blooms delivery van, parked near my house the day the boys disappeared." The other end of the line went silent. Sarah could almost feel Emily processing the implications, the sudden shift from polite pleasantries to the raw, unspoken tragedy that defined Sarah's existence. Finally, Emily's voice returned, hushed, tinged with a distant memory. "Oh, Sarah, that terrible day. I remember it like it was yesterday. The whole town was devastated." She paused, then continued, a thoughtful frown audible in her tone. "The van? I don't recall Mrs. Stone ever mentioning a delivery to your place. She was so meticulous about every order." Hope, a fragile butterfly, fluttered in Sarah's chest. Did she ever mention anything unusual around that time? A big order? A strange delivery? Emily was quiet for a moment, the faint rustle of paper audible on her end, as if she were sifting through old mental files. "You know, now that you mention it, Mrs. Stone was acting quite a peculiar around that time. She was usually so precise, everything done by the book, but for a few weeks leading up to her retirement that fall she was distracted. She kept talking about a large, confidential order or a very special delivery that took her far out of town. Said it was the most unusual request she'd ever handled. She never gave details, though. Just that it was a very sensitive arrangement." Sensitive arrangement. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. They were far too formal, too coded, for a simple floral delivery. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Sensitive arrangement," she repeated, the phrase tasting like ash on her tongue. Did she ever say where she went, or who it was for? "No, never," Emily replied, her voice tinged with regret. She was very tight-lipped about it, said it was strictly confidential, part of her discreet delivery service. She always had a few unusual clients who needed things handled quietly, but this one seemed different. She looked burdened by it, almost. A chill snaked down Sarah's spine, far colder than the Oregon air. A discreet delivery service. Sensitive arrangements. And a van, conspicuously parked in her backyard on the very morning her sons vanished. The connection, once a flicker of unease, now began to solidify into something far more sinister. The flower shop, it seemed, was more than just a place for roses and lilies. It might have been a clandestine gateway to a truth Sarah was only just beginning to comprehend. The silence that followed Emily's words was not empty. It was filled with the terrifying echoes of a past carefully orchestrated, a truth deliberately concealed. The words sensitive arrangements echoed in Sarah's mind long after she hung up the phone with Emily. They clung to her like a shroud, chilling and persistent. The innocent charm of briarwood blooms had curdled into something sinister, a seemingly benign front for operations far removed from bouquets and corsages. A desperate, almost manic energy seized Sarah. For 3 decades, she had been a passive victim, a grieving mother caught in the suffocating grip of an unsolved mystery. Now, armed with a tiny flicker of truth, she felt a surge of purpose. She would not wait for answers. She would chase them down herself. Her first stop, the next morning, was the Briarwood Public Library. The building, a stately brick structure with tall, arched windows, usually offered a hushed sanctuary. Today, it felt like a battlefield, a place where she might uncover weapons against her long-held sorrow. Mrs. Albright, the librarian, a woman whose own hair had turned silver since 1981, offered a sympathetic nod, a silent acknowledgement of Sarah's unending grief. Sarah made her way to the archives, a dimly lit corner filled with dusty microfilm readers and rows of bound newspapers. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten stories. She started with the Briarwood Chronicle, meticulously scrolling through the microfilmed pages of 1981, her eyes aching from the strain, searching for any mention of Briarwood blooms, any advertisement that might shed light on its services. Page after page, blurry headlines about town council meetings and high school football scores blurred into an indistinguishable stream. Hours bled into one another. Her back ached, her eyes burned, but she pressed on, driven by a fierce resolve. Then, late in the afternoon, buried among the classifieds of a mid-July issue, she found it. A small, unassuming advertisement, barely an inch square. It was for Briarwood blooms. Most of the text was standard, promoting flowers for all occasions, but at the bottom, in slightly smaller italicized print, were the words that made her breath catch in her throat. Discreet. Long-distance deliveries for sensitive arrangements. Inquire within for confidential services. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound recognition, coursed through her. Emily's words, sensitive arrangement, now had a terrifying context. This wasn't just about flowers. This was about something else entirely. Something clandestine and unsettling. The ambiguity of sensitive arrangements gnawed at her, hinting at a hidden world operating beneath the placid surface of Briarwood. What kind of sensitive arrangements would require a flower shop van to be parked suspiciously close to her house the morning her children vanished? She requested a printout of the ad, the flimsy paper feeling monumental in her hands. Next, she delved into the city directories from the early 1980s, searching for any listing or mention of Mrs. Evelyn Stone beyond her connection to the flower shop. She found nothing unusual, just the typical civic involvement and a brief obituary for her husband. But the seed of suspicion had taken firm root. This discreet wording, this confidential services tagline, it spoke of a deliberate secrecy, a service designed to operate outside the usual scrutiny. The police, in their initial desperation to find her children, had focused on abductors, on random acts of cruelty. They had never once considered the possibility that a seemingly innocent local business could be involved, or that the disappearance might have been orchestrated. As Sarah walked out of the library, the late afternoon sun casting long, lonely shadows, the world around her seemed to pulse with a newfound, terrifying clarity. The quiet streets of Briarwood, once a symbol of comfort, now felt like a stage set for a hidden drama, every familiar building potentially concealing a piece of the puzzle. The memory of her son's laughter, once a source of comfort, now served as a relentless prod, pushing her deeper into a labyrinth of secrets she was only just beginning to navigate. The path ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in 30 years, Sarah felt a glimmer of something beyond despair, a fierce, desperate hope for truth. Armed with the elusive advertisement from the old newspaper, Sarah felt a renewed surge of urgency. The library, for all its quiet charm, had become a hotbed of unsettling revelations. The phrase, "discreet, long-distance deliveries for sensitive arrangements," pulsed in her mind, a beacon in the 30 years of darkness. It suggested a hidden purpose for Briarwood blooms, one far more complex than floral artistry. Her next step was less about searching dusty archives and more about connecting dots, drawing on her own memories and the collective whispers of a small town. She thought about Mrs. Stone, her polite, almost prim demeanor. It seemed impossible that such a woman would be involved in anything illicit. But the ad, stark and unambiguous, spoke a different truth. Sarah spent the following days making calls, not just to old acquaintances, but to anyone who had lived in Briarwood long enough to remember the town's subtle undercurrents. She spoke to retired postal workers, former city clerks, even an elderly woman who had once owned the town's general store. Slowly, painstakingly, fragments of information began to surface, like pebbles surfacing after a long rain. A hushed comment here, a knowing glance there. It seemed Briarwood blooms under Mrs. Stone's ownership had a quiet, almost legendary reputation for handling unusual situations. Not illegal in the common sense, but definitely unconventional. People spoke of desperate families, whispered about unwanted pregnancies, and the quiet movement of infants to new homes. It wasn't talked about openly, but it was known, in the way small-town secrets often are, an unspoken understanding passed between generations. Briarwood Blooms, it seemed, wasn't just a florist, it was a conduit, a silent helper in the delicate, often heartbreaking business of adoption, particularly when anonymity and distance were paramount. This realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Her sons, gone. Not kidnapped by a stranger, but moved. Could James have known about this? Had he orchestrated something unspeakable? The thought was a venomous snake, coiling in her gut, but it also offered a horrifying, desperate sliver of hope. If they were moved, not taken, then they might still be alive. Driven by this harrowing new hypothesis, Sarah returned to the library, focusing her search on any records related to adoptions or child welfare in the early 80s that might have a connection to local businesses. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack. The formal records were unyielding, tightly sealed and anonymized. But Sarah was looking for anomalies, for a loose thread. Then, tucked away in an old ledger of local business transactions, records that dated back decades and were rarely disturbed, she found it. An entry for Briarwood Blooms, dated just 2 days before her boys vanished. The amount was unusually large, a sum far exceeding any typical flower order. The description was cryptic, almost coded. Services rendered. 3 identical bouquets. The word bouquets was underlined twice as if to highlight its euphemistic nature, and next to it, scrawled in a hasty, almost illegible hand, were the initials, NBAA, Portland, OR. Sarah's breath hitched. NBAA. She recognized the acronym immediately from her brief foray into adoption agency research. It stood for New Beginnings Adoption Agency, and Portland, Oregon was a significant distance from Briarwood, lending chilling credence to the long-distance deliveries advertised by Mrs. Stone. The room, once hushed and still, seemed to hum with a frantic energy. 3 identical bouquets. 3 boys. The timing was too precise, the location too specific, the phrasing too ominous to be coincidence. A dizzying wave of shock and adrenaline washed over Sarah. Her sons, her beloved triplets, hadn't disappeared into thin air. They hadn't been violently snatched. They had been delivered. A transaction, not a crime of passion. The revelation was both a searing pain and a fragile, terrifying hope. New Beginnings Adoption Agency. That was her next agonizing step. The path was becoming clearer, but each step revealed a new layer of betrayal, a new depth of pain. The journey to Portland felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly swift. Each mile marker that flashed by the passenger window of Sarah's aging sedan felt like another nail in the coffin of her old life, while simultaneously ushering in the possibility of a new one. The quiet, tree-lined streets of Briarwood gave way to the bustling metropolitan sprawl of Oregon's largest city, a stark contrast to the small town she had rarely left since 1981. The address she had gleaned from the old ledger led her to a respectable brick building in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. New Beginnings Adoption Agency, the polished brass plaque read, a stark clinical name for a place that, if her suspicions were correct, held the key to her shattered family. Sarah's hands were clammy, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, the bell above chiming a surprisingly cheerful note that felt grotesquely out of place. Inside, the reception area was hushed, adorned with comforting artwork depicting smiling families and blossoming trees. It was designed to exude warmth and hope, a stark contrast to the icy dread coiling in Sarah's stomach. She approached the reception desk, her voice barely a whisper as she requested to speak with someone who had worked there in 1981. After a few tense minutes, a woman with kind, weary eyes emerged from an inner office. "I'm Eleanor Vance, the current director," she said, her voice soft. "How can I help you?" Sarah, clutching the crumpled newspaper ad and the grainy printout of the van from the video, explained her purpose. She spoke of her sons, of the agonizing 30 years, and finally of the Briarwood Blooms connection. Eleanor listened with a professional, yet increasingly concerned expression. "I see," she said, her gaze lingering on the ad. "Most of our records from that era are strictly confidential and archived off-site, but there was one employee who's been with us for a very, very long time. She retired last year, but she still consults occasionally. Miss Helen Davis. She knows almost everything that's ever happened here." A fresh surge of adrenaline coursed through Sarah. Could I meet with her? Eleanor made a call, her voice low and apologetic, explaining Sarah's unusual request. To Sarah's immense relief, Miss Davis agreed to a brief meeting that afternoon. Hours later, Sarah sat across from Miss Helen Davis in a small, sterile conference room. Miss Davis was a woman in her late 70s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her movements precise and deliberate. Her eyes, though, held a depth that spoke of countless lives touched, countless stories held within their quiet gaze. Sarah laid out her evidence. The old advertisement, the blurred image of the van, the cryptic ledger entry. She spoke of her lost boys, her voice thick with emotion, but maintaining a steely resolve. Miss Davis listened, her face a mask of polite neutrality, but Sarah saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a faint shadow of recognition. "Mrs. Thorne," Miss Davis began, her voice calm but firm, "our records are highly confidential. We operate under strict ethical guidelines. Children entrusted to our care are placed with loving families, and their privacy is paramount." "I understand that, Miss Davis," Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. "But my children weren't entrusted. They were stolen. Or worse, sold. That van, that florist. It's connected. Please, just tell me if anything about 3 infant boys, brought in unusually, stands out from that year, anything at all." Sarah then, on a whim, pulled out her laptop and played the snippet of the backyard video, zooming in on the Briarwood Blooms van. The vehicle, innocuous to the untrained eye, was a stark anomaly to Sarah, and she hoped to Miss Davis. As the image of the van filled the screen, a subtle change occurred in Miss Davis's demeanor. Her perfectly composed posture seemed to soften, her gaze fixed on the screen. A slow, thoughtful sigh escaped her lips. "The Briarwood Blooms van," she murmured, almost to herself. "I remember that. It was unusual." She paused, as if sifting through long-buried memories, her brow furrowed. "Yes, I do remember a case. 3 infants, boys. Identical, if I recall correctly." Her voice dropped, a note of deep contemplation entering it. "It was quite irregular. They were listed as abandoned at the agency's doorstep in the early hours of a summer morning. But I always found that hard to believe. 3 perfectly healthy infants, all at once. It just didn't add up." Sarah leaned forward, her breath held captive in her lungs. And Miss Davis's eyes, now filled with a distant memory, met Sarah's. They each had these tiny, delicate silver bracelets, identical, with tiny, almost imperceptible etchings. We called them identity bracelets. We documented them, of course, as they were the only personal effects they arrived with. They were quickly placed due to the high demand for healthy newborns. It was all handled with unusual haste. To bypass any lingering questions, I suppose. She paused, then a knowing look passed across her face. "Yes, I remember Mrs. Stone, too. She spoke of a very sensitive case she'd helped facilitate, a family who needed absolute discretion." 3 identity bracelets. Sarah's mind reeled. The details aligned with a horrifying precision. This was it, the thread she had been searching for. The children, her children, hadn't been lost to the void. They had been discreetly, meticulously placed. The cold, logical reality of it was more devastating than any wild theory of abduction. But it also meant they were somewhere. And for the first time in 30 years, a single, undeniable truth pierced through the fog of her grief. Her sons were alive. Miss Helen Davis, her composure now completely shattered, led Sarah to a dimly lit room filled with filing cabinets that smelled of old paper and forgotten lives. Her initial reluctance had given way to a quiet, almost mournful determination. "I never liked how that case felt," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper as she pulled out a thick, nondescript file. "It was too clean, too perfectly packaged. It always bothered me." She opened the file, its contents a stark contrast to the innocent flowers of Briarwood Blooms. Inside were intake forms, medical clearances, and adoption decrees. Sarah's eyes, burning with a mixture of fear and anticipation, scanned the pages. There they were, documented in bureaucratic black and white. 3 male infants labeled Foundlings, Case 81-003A, 81-0003B, 81-0003C. The dates matched. The circumstances, as Miss Davis had stated, were listed as abandoned at agency doorstep. They were deemed healthy, no signs of neglect or abuse, Miss Davis explained, her finger tracing the words. And due to their unique circumstances and high demand for healthy newborns, they were processed and placed quickly. The agency was under a lot of pressure then to meet quotas. Sarah's gaze darted to the adoption records. The new families were listed only by initials. Mr. and Mrs. R.S., placement in Seattle, W.A., Mr. and Mrs. D.G., placement in San Diego, C.A., and Mr. and Mrs. M.W., placement in Phoenix, A.Z. The names were maddeningly absent, a barrier designed to protect the very privacy that now tormented Sarah. But the locations, so far flung, twisted the knife deeper into her heart. Her sons, so close in their infancy, scattered across the American West. Then Miss Davis pointed to a separate, smaller slip of paper stapled to the inside of the file. It was a formal notification of the Foundlings, filed with local authorities but signed by an anonymous informant. Beneath the signature, a handwritten note in faded blue ink, almost erased by time, read, "Source confirmed contact with Mrs. Evelyn Stone. Briarwood blooms. Location, Briarwood, or. Date of notification, July 28, 1981. Sarah's breath caught. The date was one day after the picnic, and the anonymous informant was registered with a post office box in a small town 2 counties away, a town James had sometimes mentioned for fishing trips. A cold, crushing certainty settled over her. She knew with an agonizing clarity who that anonymous informant was. "This informant," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did they ever provide any other details?" Miss Davis hesitated, her eyes distant. The informant stated he had found the infants in a basket near a local park, but he seemed oddly distant, and he was very clear about needing absolute anonymity, citing personal reasons and a desire for the children to have a fresh start. She then pulled out a separate, even more discreet financial ledger. It was a record of facilitator fees, payments made to third parties for ensuring smooth, confidential adoptions, particularly in cases of abandonment. "This is the entry for your boys," Miss Davis said, her finger resting on a line. "A large sum, paid directly to a JT at a P.O. box address matching that of our anonymous informant. It was paid a few days after the children were placed." The initial JT was like a branding iron on Sarah's soul. James Thorne, her husband, the man who had vowed to protect their children, who had stood beside her through years of agonizing grief, had orchestrated their disappearance. He hadn't just abandoned her, he had abandoned them. The truth, when it finally coalesced, was a shattering blow. James, overwhelmed by the sudden, crushing weight of 3 infants, the relentless financial strain, and a creeping depression he never admitted, had found a desperate, immoral solution. He hadn't been strong enough to ask for help or to admit defeat. Instead, he had carefully, methodically, planned their disappearance, making it look like a tragic abduction. He had used Mrs. Stone's discreet delivery service to facilitate their transfer to the adoption agency, effectively selling them to new lives, believing in his twisted despair that he was giving them a better chance than he could provide. He had done it without her knowledge, without her consent, leaving her to endure a living hell of endless searching and unbearable sorrow. The world seemed to spin, colors blurring, the air thick with the dust of 30 years of lies. Her husband, her partner in grief, was the architect of her torment. The betrayal was so profound, so heinous, it threatened to buckle her knees. Yet, through the searing pain, a single unwavering beacon of hope ignited. Adam, Benjamin, Christopher. They weren't gone. They were out there. Grown men now, living lives she knew nothing about. The horror of James's actions was immense, but the possibility of seeing her sons again, of finally understanding what had happened, was a powerful, intoxicating promise. She had to find them. She had to unravel this web of deceit, not just for herself, but for the 3 boys who had lost their mother and their true identities to a desperate man's unforgivable secret. The raw, searing pain of James's betrayal was a fresh wound, but it was overshadowed by a truth that thrummed beneath Sarah's skin like a powerful, forgotten melody. Her boys were alive. The initial shock, the dizziness, the crushing weight of deceit began to transmute into a fierce, unwavering resolve. She had lost them once, through no fault of her own. She would not lose this chance to find them again. Miss Davis, clearly affected by the decades-old deception and the depth of Sarah's suffering, became an unexpected ally. Working discreetly, navigating the labyrinthine privacy laws and the agency's old, often incomplete records, she managed to unearth what little more information existed. The records from 1981, designed for maximum confidentiality, had been deliberately sparse. But cross-referencing intake dates, the specific details of the identity bracelets, and the general locations of placement, Miss Davis meticulously pieced together a clearer, albeit still incomplete, picture. "It's a long shot, Sarah," Miss Davis had warned, her voice heavy with the weight of ethical boundaries and slim chances. These are all adult individuals now. They've lived their lives, they have families, they may not even know they were adopted. But the words were wasted on Sarah. Hope, once a distant star, was now a blinding sun. Slowly, agonizingly, the puzzle pieces began to slot into place. Adam, her firstborn, the natural leader, had been placed with a couple in Seattle, Washington. His new name, according to the cryptic notes, was Ethan. Benjamin, the quiet observer, had found a home in San Diego, California, and was now known as Daniel. And Christopher, her joyful, effervescent youngest, had grown up in the rugged landscape of Phoenix, Arizona, bearing the name Marcus. 3 names, 3 cities, 3 lives lived completely apart, unknowingly echoing each other. Sarah traced the routes on a worn atlas, the lines connecting Briarwood to these far-flung corners of the country. Seattle, with its misty skies and tech boom. San Diego, vibrant with sun and ocean spray. Phoenix, baked in the desert heat, surrounded by saguaro cacti. How different their worlds must have become. The task ahead was monumental. How do you approach an adult stranger and tell them their entire life, their very identity, is built on a lie? How do you reconcile a 30-year absence with a sudden, devastating truth? Sarah knew it would be difficult, perhaps even painful for her sons, but the alternative, to live the rest of her life knowing they existed but never finding them, was simply unthinkable. She sold some of her dwindling investments, not enough to be comfortable but enough to fund this desperate pilgrimage. She packed a small suitcase, a practical collection of clothes, but more importantly, a worn photo album filled with pictures of her boys from before 1981. Pictures of them in their blue overalls, their gap-toothed smiles, their innocent eyes. Proof. Irrefutable, heartbreaking proof of who they were and who she was to them. The old sedan, her loyal companion through years of quiet grief, became her vessel of hope. The engine coughed to life, a rough, determined purr. As she pulled out of the driveway, leaving the house of ghosts behind, Briarwood, Oregon, shrank in her rearview mirror. Sarah Thorne, the grieving mother, was no more. She was a woman on a quest, a pilgrim of lost time, driven by an unshakable maternal instinct to reclaim what had been so cruelly taken. The journey ahead was daunting, fraught with the unknown, but for the first time in 3 decades, Sarah felt a profound sense of purpose. She was going to find her sons, all 3 of them. The rain, a perpetual companion in Seattle, slicked the city streets as Sarah drove, the wipers battling the relentless downpour. The GPS voice, calm and devoid of emotion, guided her through the labyrinthine urban landscape. Her destination, a sleek, modern building of glass and steel in the city's bustling downtown. According to Miss Davis's careful, if legally tenuous, research, Adam, now Ethan, Thorne, was a successful architect. The irony was not lost on Sarah. Her child, who had disappeared from a small town in Oregon, now designed towering structures in a major metropolitan hub. She found herself outside a trendy coffee shop on a bustling corner, the address Miss Davis had provided. Sarah had opted for a public, neutral location, hoping to ease the inevitable shock. She clutched a steaming cup of Earl Grey, the warmth doing little to soothe the ice in her veins. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm, a drumbeat of anticipation and terror. What would he look like? Would she recognize him? Would he even believe her? And then she saw him. He emerged from the building across the street, a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit, an architectural blueprint tube tucked under his arm. His stride was confident, purposeful. As he neared the coffee shop, he turned, and for a fleeting moment the light caught his profile. Her breath hitched. The strong jawline, the subtle curve of his nose. It was Adam, her Adam. Grown into a man she didn't know, yet recognized with an almost painful familiarity. His hair, a darker blonde than she remembered, was neatly cut, but the slight wave was still there. He had his father's height, but something in his eyes, even from this distance, was undeniably hers. He entered the coffee shop, and Sarah, summoning every ounce of courage, followed. He was at the counter, ordering, his voice a deep baritone that was both strange and utterly familiar. She approached him, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice reedy. He turned, his eyes a startling blue, widening slightly in surprise. He was handsome, with an air of quiet intelligence. "Yes, can I help you?" His tone was polite, distant. Sarah's carefully rehearsed words evaporated. "Adam," she blurted out, her voice raw with emotion. "You're Adam." His brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion, then annoyance crossing his face. "I think you have me mistaken for someone else. My name is Ethan, Ethan Thorne." "No," Sarah insisted, tears stinging her eyes. "No, you're not mistaken. You're Adam. Adam Thorne, my son." She saw the immediate shift in his eyes, from polite confusion to a guarded suspicion, then a flicker of something akin to fear. This was the moment. The point of no return. "My name is Ethan," he repeated, his voice firm, stepping back slightly. "I think you need to leave." "Please," Sarah pleaded, desperation making her voice shake. She fumbled in her bag, pulling out the worn photo album. "Just look at these, please." She opened it to a page of 3 identical little boys in blue overalls, playing in a backyard. "This is you, this is Adam, and Benjamin, and Christopher." He stared at the photographs, his eyes scanning the faces, then darting to her, a dawning comprehension mixed with utter disbelief spreading across his features. These are my brothers and me," he mumbled, his voice hoarse, a tremor of shock in it. "But I don't have brothers. I was an only child. My parents told me." "Your adoptive parents," Sarah corrected gently, her voice cracking. "You were adopted, Ethan. All 3 of you were. They were separated, and I am your mother." She then pulled out the most potent piece of evidence, a small, tarnished silver bracelet, barely larger than a coin, with 3 tiny, almost imperceptible etchings. An A, a B, and a C. It was delicate, worn smooth in places from age. "This was yours, Adam, the one you wore on the day you disappeared. Miss Davis, from New Beginnings, remembered it. She said you and your brothers each had one. You called it your lucky charm." Ethan's eyes, suddenly wide with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite decipher, dropped to his wrist. Beneath the cuff of his suit, a thin silver chain glinted. Dangling from it was an identical, small, tarnished bracelet. The same size, the same shape, bearing the same faint etchings. He had worn it his entire life, believing it a simple gift from his adoptive parents, a childhood keepsake. The coffee shop around them faded into a blur. The noise, the chatter, the clinking of cups. It all disappeared. Only their 2 faces remained, suspended in a moment of earth-shattering revelation. Ethan, the successful architect, stood utterly stunned, his carefully constructed reality crumbling around him. And Sarah, the grieving mother, watched him, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. A tear of sorrow for the lost years, but also a tear of unspeakable, overwhelming hope. She had found her first son. The long, agonizing journey had begun. Leaving Seattle with the lingering echo of Ethan's stunned silence, Sarah felt a mixture of profound relief and an aching tenderness. Her first son. Alive. It was a truth she still struggled to fully grasp, a miracle she clutched fiercely. But the road ahead was long, and 2 more sons awaited. The drive south along the Pacific coast was a blur of towering trees giving way to sun-drenched vineyards and eventually the vast, shimmering expanse of the Pacific Ocean. San Diego, California. A city vibrant with sunshine and a carefree spirit was a stark contrast to the misty solemnity of Seattle. Sarah had researched Daniel's new life as best she could through public records and Miss Davis's careful hints. He was a surfing instructor, operating a small school near Pacific Beach. The thought of her quiet, contemplative Benjamin, now teaching a sport so inherently free and wild, brought a faint, wistful smile to her lips. She found his surf school nestled among a row of brightly painted storefronts, the salty tang of the ocean air already invigorating. Surfboards lined the exterior, and a faded sign read, "Daniel's Waves, Ride the Tide." Sarah hesitated, watching the rhythmic crash of the waves, her heart thrumming with renewed trepidation. This was different from Ethan, who had been found in the sterile environment of an office. Here, the raw energy of the ocean felt both welcoming and overwhelming. She spotted him almost immediately. A man in his late 30s, his skin bronzed by the sun, his hair bleached by salt water, stood on the sand, patiently guiding a young boy through the motions of catching a wave. He moved with a graceful, unhurried ease, his broad shoulders a testament to a life spent wrestling with the ocean. As he turned to offer encouragement, the sun caught his profile and Sarah saw it, the familiar curve of his brow, the slight tilt of his head when he listened intently. It was Benjamin. Her Benjamin, embodied in this strong, sun-kissed man. Sarah approached cautiously as his lesson ended. He gathered his board, his dark eyes, so like James's, but with a deeper, more introspective quality, scanning the beach. He hadn't spotted her yet. "Daniel?" Sarah's voice was steadier this time, a quiet question carried on the sea breeze. He turned, his gaze falling upon her, a polite, inquisitive expression on his face. "Yes, can I help you?" "My name is Sarah Thorne," she began, her voice gaining strength, "and I believe I'm your mother." His easy smile vanished, replaced by a look of wary confusion. He pushed his sunglasses up onto his head, revealing eyes that, up close, held a depth of introspection Sarah remembered. "My mother," he repeated, a low laugh escaping him, tinged with disbelief. "I think you're mistaken. My mother passed away 5 years ago." "Your adoptive mother, Daniel," Sarah corrected gently, her gaze holding his. "I am your biological mother. And your name was Benjamin." A flicker of something Sarah couldn't quite name. A primal recognition, perhaps, or a deep-seated longing, crossed his face. He seemed to shrink, the confident surf instructor momentarily replaced by a vulnerable boy. "My parents, they always told me I was their biological child, that they adopted my siblings but not me." His voice was low, almost a whisper, laden with a long-held, unspoken confusion. This was the opening. "They weren't your siblings, Daniel," Sarah said, stepping closer. "Not by blood, and you weren't an only child. You were part of a triplet, and your brothers. They looked just like you, and me." She pulled out the photo album, opened to the page with the 3 boys in their blue overalls. "This is you, Benjamin, and Adam and Christopher." Daniel's eyes widened, fixated on the image. He picked up the album, his fingers tracing the outline of his 4-year-old self. I always felt different," he confessed, his voice thick with a strange mixture of revelation and sorrow. "Like a piece of me was missing. My parents were wonderful, but there was always this feeling of being an outsider, even in my own family. I never understood it." Sarah's heart ached for him, for the unspoken isolation he had carried for so long. "That's because a piece of you was missing, Benjamin. 2 pieces. Your brothers." She then held out the identical silver bracelet she had carried with her, etched with a faint B. "This was yours. You wore it on the day you disappeared. Miss Davis, from the agency, remembered them. She said they were your identity bracelets." Daniel's hand instinctively went to his own wrist beneath the worn wetsuit sleeve. He pulled back the fabric, revealing a thin leather cord. Hanging from it was the familiar glint of silver. It was identical to the one in Sarah's palm, etched with a B, worn smooth by years of contact with his skin. "I've had this since I was a baby," he murmured, his voice laced with awe. "My mom told me it was a good luck charm from her travels. I never took it off." Tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness but of a profound, liberating understanding. The lifelong feeling of being an outsider, of a missing piece, suddenly made sense. His quiet nature, his deep connection to the ocean. Perhaps these were echoes of the Benjamin she remembered, the quiet, observant twin. A wave crashed behind them, its roar a punctuation mark to the life-altering revelation. Daniel, the surf instructor, dropped the photo album and reached out, his hand clasping Sarah's, holding the two identical bracelets together. For the first time in 30 years, Benjamin, now Daniel, felt whole, the missing piece of his soul finally found in the eyes of the woman who had never stopped searching. The journey was far from over, but a profound connection had been forged on the sun-drenched sands of San Diego. The desert air in Phoenix, Arizona was a dry, unyielding heat, a stark contrast to the humid embrace of Oregon or the ocean breezes of California. Sarah felt the sun bake into her skin as she drove, the landscape shifting from urban sprawl to vast, dusty plains dotted with saguaro cacti. This was Marcus's world. The last of her triplets, the once effervescent Christopher, now a man running a family ranch. The thought of him, rooted in this rugged, independent life, stirred a quiet anxiety within her. Christopher had always been the most outwardly joyful, but also, paradoxically, the one most prone to withdrawing into himself when faced with strong emotions. The ranch, Whispering Pines, lay nestled at the end of a long, unpaved road, a cluster of low-slung buildings that blended seamlessly into the ochre landscape. Horses grazed in fenced pastures, their tails swishing lazily, and the scent of hay and dust filled the air. Sarah parked her sedan, feeling a profound sense of isolation. This wouldn't be like the last two meetings. This would be a confrontation, a final reckoning with her past. She found him in the barn, a sturdy man with broad shoulders and hands calloused by labor. His dark hair, almost black from the sun, was pulled back from a weathered face. He was tending to a horse, his movements economical and strong. As he turned, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes, the same intense blue as Adam's and Benjamin's, met hers, but in his, Sarah saw guardedness, a quiet intensity that was almost formidable. "Marcus Thorne?" she asked, her voice hesitant in the vastness of the barn. He paused, his hand resting gently on the horse's mane. "That's me. Can I help you?" His voice was low, gravelly, with an underlying wariness that Sarah immediately recognized. "My name is Sarah Thorne," she began, choosing her words carefully, knowing this would be the hardest of the three. "And I believe I am your mother." A hard, almost imperceptible flicker crossed his face, a tightening of his jaw. He didn't flinch, didn't recoil, but his posture stiffened. "My mother passed away when I was a child, ma'am, and I don't recall ever meeting you." His tone was polite but firm, an invisible wall erected between them. "Your adoptive mother, Marcus," Sarah corrected, her voice gentle yet insistent. "She was a wonderful woman, I'm sure. But you were adopted. All three of you were. Your name was Christopher." He slowly set down the horsebrush, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know my own history. My parents told me everything. I was adopted as a baby. I was an only child. I don't have any siblings. And I certainly don't have a birth mother who just shows up after 30 years. There was a raw edge to his voice now, a mixture of disbelief and a deep-seated protectiveness. He was clearly the most guarded, the most emotionally self-sufficient of her sons. "I understand your skepticism, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice filled with an earnest plea. "It's a lot to take in. But I have proof, and you have brothers, identical brothers. She pulled out the photo album, opened to the page of the 3 smiling toddlers. "This is you, Christopher, Adam, Benjamin, all together." Marcus's eyes, usually so composed, widened almost imperceptibly as he stared at the photograph. He picked it up, his strong hands trembling slightly. He looked at the familiar features of the boy in the middle, then at the 2 identical faces flanking him. His breath hitched. These faces," he mumbled, a crack in his formidable facade. "I've seen them before, in dreams, in my own face in the mirror sometimes." His adoptive parents had been honest about his adoption, but had always maintained he was an only child, found as an infant, a unique little miracle. He had grown up with a quiet sense of difference, a feeling that a part of his story was missing but had learned to suppress it, to rely only on himself. "You've always felt it, haven't you, Christopher?" Sarah whispered, tears blurring her vision. "That something was missing. It was them. Your brothers. They're alive. I found Adam and Benjamin." She then extended her hand, holding out the 3rd silver identity bracelet bearing the faint C. "And this is yours. You wore it the day you disappeared. All 3 of you did. It was the only thing you had left of your real family." Marcus looked from the bracelet in her hand to his own wrist. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing a faded tattoo of a galloping horse. Beneath it, hidden almost entirely by the tattoo, was a thin, silver band. He pulled it up, his eyes widening in disbelief. It was the same bracelet, worn smooth and tarnished, with the same faint C etching. He had worn it his entire life, a private comfort, a talisman against the unspoken loneliness. He'd been told it was a rare antique, found at a flea market by his adoptive father. The barrier around Marcus, painstakingly built over 30 years of quiet solitude, began to crumble. The unshakable proof, the visual echo of his own face in the photographs, the tangible presence of the bracelet he'd always worn, combined with the raw, undeniable sincerity in Sarah's eyes, was simply too much. He looked at her, his eyes welling, and in that moment, the hardened rancher melted into the 4-year-old boy who had been lost. A single tear tracked a path through the dust on his cheek. "Mom?" The word was choked, unfamiliar yet profoundly meaningful. Sarah stepped forward, her arms open, and Marcus, with a guttural cry, fell into her embrace. The powerful arms that had wrangled horses now held her, a fierce, desperate grip. It was a raw, primal reunion, 3 decades of unspoken grief and longing pouring out in that dusty barn. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the unspoken promise of a new beginning. A family, finally, miraculously, reunited. The small rustic cabin nestled amidst the towering pines of a quiet retreat in the Oregon Cascades felt 1,000,000 miles away from the bustling cities and dusty ranches. It was neutral ground, chosen by Sarah, a place where the 3 brothers could meet for the first time without the pressures of their separate lives, a place where their fractured family could attempt to coalesce. Sarah watched from the porch as the 3 men walked towards each other across the sun-dappled grass. Ethan, the architect, stood tall and composed, a subtle nervousness in his precise movements. Daniel, the surf instructor, moved with a relaxed, almost fluid grace, yet his dark eyes held a raw vulnerability. Marcus, the rancher, was a figure of quiet strength, his shoulders broad, but his usual stoicism softened by an undeniable tension. There was a moment of awkward silence as they stopped, a few feet apart. 3 faces, identical in their fundamental bone structure, yet etched with the stories of wildly different lives. Adam, Benjamin, Christopher, Ethan, Daniel, Marcus, each a mirror, each a stranger. Then Daniel, ever the less inhibited, took a step forward, a tentative smile gracing his lips. "So, this is what 40 years of separation looks like, huh?" he said, his voice a soft rumble. Ethan let out a short, incredulous laugh, the tension breaking. It's overwhelming. He extended a hand. Ethan. Marcus, surprisingly, was the next to move, his hand reaching out to Daniel's. Marcus! There was a quiet understanding in his gaze, a shared history of unspoken feelings. Sarah, watching from a distance, felt a tidal wave of emotion crash over her. They were so different, products of their environments, their adoptive families. Ethan, with his quiet intensity and intellectual precision, still carried a hint of Adam's leadership. Daniel, with his calm demeanor and deep empathy, mirrored Benjamin's contemplative nature. And Marcus, self-reliant and strong, held a flicker of Christopher's youthful exuberance, now channeled into a rugged independence. Yet, beneath the layers of their adult lives, an undeniable connection hummed between them, an invisible thread weaving through decades of separation. The first few hours were a dance of tentative steps. They talked cautiously at first about their lives, their adoptive families, their childhoods. They discovered shared mannerisms, a habit of running a hand through their hair when deep in thought, a particular way of laughing, a tendency to lean their heads slightly when listening intently. It was uncanny, disorienting, and profoundly moving. Later, as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in fiery hues, they gathered around a crackling fire pit. Sarah sat between Ethan and Daniel, with Marcus on the other side of Daniel. The air was cool, scented with pine and wood smoke. For the first time, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. "I never stopped looking," she said, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "Not for one single day. Every child I saw, every face in a crowd, I searched for you." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch firm and comforting. "We didn't know," he said, his voice raw. "Our parents, they loved us fiercely. They told us we were adopted, but they gave us a story that made sense. A contained, safe story. We never knew. We never knew we had a whole other life, a mother who was looking." Daniel nodded, gazing into the dancing flames. "I always felt it, though, that something was missing, a piece of the puzzle. Now I know what it was." He looked at his brothers. "It was you two, and you, Mom." Marcus, usually the most reserved, spoke next, his voice quiet but steady. "It's a lot to process. The betrayal, the lies. But seeing you all, it's like a part of me that was always cold suddenly feels warm." Sarah smiled through her tears, tears not of sorrow but of an overwhelming, joyous relief. "We have so much to talk about," she said, squeezing their hands. "So many years to catch up on, so many stories to tell." They spoke into the night, sharing anecdotes from their childhoods, the vastly different paths they had taken, the dreams they had pursued. Sarah filled them in on her life, the quiet resilience of her search, the unwavering hope that had kept her going. There was no easy resolution, no magical erasure of the 30 lost years. The pain of what James had done, the complexity of their new identities would take time to unravel. They were individuals now, fully formed men with their own lives, their own families, their own complexities. They wouldn't suddenly become the 4-year-old triplets in blue overalls. But as the moon rose high above the Cascades, casting a silvery glow on the cabin, Sarah looked at her sons. Her 3 sons. Different, yet connected by an undeniable, ancient bond. The lost family wasn't magically whole, not in the way it would have been if they had never been separated. But it was found. It was beginning, tentatively to heal. The silence that had filled her home for 3 decades had been replaced by the quiet hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, and the steady, comforting presence of her children. The Thorne family, though forever marked by what had happened, was finally, profoundly and miraculously ready for a new beginning.